You said that critical race theorists, in your book, you wrote, their work showed how racism could be present without racists, which set off sort of, not alarm bells, but just reminders of other phrases like structural racism or systemic racism. Is that what you're referring to there?
Yeah, and again, I don't understand why people lose their minds over. I guess I do. I understand why that's offensive on the surface. But again, if you slow down and you just if we ask ourselves, what are patterns maybe that have been put in place that make it such that even though we say everyone is equal, everyone has a shot based on merit to get this job, um, even though we say that, because of patterns, policies, or just ways of being, you only have white people who are in these leadership roles. You only have white head coaches in the NFL until recently, for example. Or at a local Christian school, I've actually got a number of Christian schools in mind. So I know people are always trying to figure out exactly which one I'm thinking of, but there's literally four that I have in mind that I've been associated with whose racial history was such that they purposely were founded in an effort to be separated from black folks. Okay. That's how they started 50 years ago or 40 years ago. And unless they made changes in the way they operate, it's it's likely that they still have only white people that are operating and running the school, even though they're located in places where there's lots of non-white folks. So is it possible, and I'm saying yes, that there's patterns, policies, and ways of being, ways of where you go to hire people, what schools you go to hire people, when you do a search to fill a leadership position, if all you've ever done is gone to a handful of only white schools or schools that are predominated by white folks, it's very likely you're going to wind up with a white person in that leadership role. So,
I think it's valid, and I mean I'm not gonna go too hard on this, but I think it's worth also saying that a lot of the conversations being had to this end in the world do seem to want to make culprits of white people on a more individual basis, or at least that's how it comes across. And it's ironic that a worldview that says it's not how something is said, it's how it's perceived or received, that it really matters, right? How the recipient.
yeah.
And then you have white people going, this doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like we're saying there's this overarching structure that's the problem. It feels like you're saying white people are the problem in the
Yeah.
words you choose and the way it comes across. And so I do think there are real reasons. I don't think Christians or white people are just being whiny or something. I think it goes deeper than that. And I think
I do too.
oftentimes we feel like we're being held accountable for the sins of people we never met.
Yeah, me too, Eric. And again, I get it. I sat in a PhD program where white people were talked negatively about for 5 years. And yeah, I know those feelings inside myself of wanting to say, well, you can't just condemn all white people for this or that. But I will say this, like this is the discipline that I've tried to embrace instead of immediately getting defensive, because that is what we tend to do. So when we feel the way you just described, Eric, which I thought was a great description of feeling like I'm being singled out as being singularly evil for being white, I think it's at least worth, or all of us, because we're all white people, I think it's at least worth asking the question, is that true? Or in what ways might that be true? Instead of immediately running to that can't be true, that there's no culpability over here anymore, because that's usually what happens. We're not racist here anymore. We don't have any racial consequence because of choices we made or the way that we've lived. And I at least want to be open to asking myself, well, I just told you, I grew up in a home where at least half of my parental, unit was very racist. So unless I've done work to sort of cleanse myself of that racism, it's pretty likely that it still lives in me somewhere.
Yeah.
You know what
Yeah,
I mean?
sure. But I would
So,
just to gently push back, I would say that's
no,
not
push back.
because you're white. It's because one of your parents were racist. And so it's
Yes.
the idea that is
Yeah.
it possibly true that I'm inherently evil and racist because I'm white? That I think is a bridge too far for most people. And I think
Agree.
it should be.
Agree.
But I also think that's where the cultural, secular conversation wants to nudge things.
But I would say, so my white skin doesn't make me inherently evil, but my white skin does immediately align me with a history. It aligns me with a group category that has done a bunch of evil in the name of race. So I just personally want to be careful that I don't just kind of dismiss that too easily.
Hmm.
And let me just explore that. Let me just explore what that's meant or looked like in my life and see, is there something that I need to repent of? Is there an attitude or something that's latently still living inside of me that I need the Spirit of God to excise out of me? You
Hmm.
know, I just don't want to move past that too quickly. Even though I totally agree with what you're saying from a secular perspective, especially as a person who's trying to live by the Spirit, who is living in a culture that has been hyper racialized. It's been hyper racialized. I can't just sort of cling to my own innocence in the midst of that. I mean,
There's
I
more
can.
work to be done, basically.
Yeah, well, yeah. And I won't do that work if I just right away dismiss those things, even though ultimately, like you're saying, I think the extreme ways that they're talked about is wrong. I at least want to explore it.
Yeah,
And I'll say most people that I'm around won't explore it. And I think
sure.
that's a problem. Most Christian people won't explore it. They just dismiss it.